The morning she reported to Fort Bragg for the first time, Staff Sergeant Maya Reyes did three things in exactly this order. She laced her boots wrong, relaced them correctly, and, then, stood at the gate for a full 90 seconds pretending to check her phone while actually watching the other soldiers walk past just to make sure she carried herself the same way they did. Shoulders. Chin. Pace. She had studied this for years, the way other people study a language they are desperate to speak fluently before anyone finds out they learned it from books. Maya had grown up in Laredo, Texas, which sits on the border the way a scar sits on skin, permanent, defining, impossible to ignore once you see it. Her father had crossed that border on a Tuesday in 1987 with $40 folded into the sole of his left shoe and a name that American mouths kept reshaping into something easier. He never complained about the reshaping. He just answered to whatever they called him and kept working. Maya had watched that her whole life, the quiet endurance of it, and she had decided somewhere around age 14 that she would build something her father could not because he had failed, but because the country had handed him a ceiling and called it a sky. She enlisted at 22, after 2 years of community college and 1 year of working double shifts at a logistics warehouse where she discovered she was exceptionally good at two things: organizing systems and staying calm when everything around her was falling apart. The Army, when she read the recruitment materials, sounded like a place built around exactly those two skills. She signed the paperwork on a Wednesday. Her father sat at the kitchen table when she told him and said nothing for so long that she thought he hadn't heard her. Then, he nodded once, slow and deliberate, and said, "Be better than everyone in the room. Always." He didn't say be careful. He didn't say come home safe. He said be better. She carried that like ammunition. Basic training broke her and rebuilt her in 8 weeks. She was not the fastest runner in her unit. She was not the strongest. But she was the one who, on the 4th week when half her unit was ready to quit after a 48-hour field exercise in Georgia's summer heat, organized the group into a rotation system so that no single person carried more than they could handle and everyone finished. Her drill sergeant watched this happen without saying a word. 3 days later, Maya found her name on a list she hadn't asked to be on. Leadership track. She moved up through the ranks with the kind of steadiness that doesn't get noticed until it suddenly does. Not flashy. Not the soldier who told stories at the mess hall that made everyone laugh. She was the one who had already fixed the problem you were about to tell a story about. She made staff sergeant in 6 years, which was not a record but was not nothing either, and she specialized in weapons systems maintenance, a field that, when she chose it, had roughly 8% female representation, a number she did not find discouraging so much as clarifying. It told her exactly where the room was that she needed to walk into. Fort Bragg in October had a particular quality to its mornings. The air came in cold and sharp, carrying pine from the tree lines beyond the training fields, and everything had the feeling of being on the edge of something, not danger exactly, but readiness. Maya liked it. She had been stationed here for 14 months and had learned the rhythms of the bass the way you learn a piece of music you practice every day, until you stop reading the notes and just play. She was assigned to the 18th Airborne Corps, working directly under Captain Daniel Hull, a compact, efficient man from Ohio who communicated primarily in clipped sentences and had the rare quality of knowing exactly what he didn't know. He trusted Maya with the weapons inventory because she had once caught a discrepancy in the ammunition records that would have caused a significant problem during a live exercise, caught it 3 days before the exercise, corrected it, and reported it upward without making anyone feel bad about the error. Howell noticed. People who notice things notice other people who notice things. On the morning that would later become the story people told, Maya was in the East Equipment Bay doing something that looked, from a distance, like fidgeting. She was adjusting the strap on her M17 sidearm, which had developed a slight misalignment in the retention mechanism, not dangerous, but imprecise, and imprecision in a weapon bothered her the way a wrong note bothers a musician. She had already logged the issue and ordered the replacement part. While she waited, she was making the manual adjustment that would hold it correctly until the part arrived. This was entirely routine. She had her sleeves rolled to the elbow because the bay was warm, and her hands were moving with the focused confidence of someone who has done this specific task hundreds of times. What was not routine was the inspection. General Marcus Webb had arrived on base that morning for what was officially classified as a routine readiness assessment, which meant approximately 40 people had been quietly panicking for 2 weeks preparing for it and then pretending, on the day, to be entirely relaxed. General Webb was 3 years from retirement and had the kind of record that made other generals speak carefully when he was in the room. 2 combat deployments in the early 2000s, one in a command role that became a case study at West Point, and a reputation for asking questions that nobody had thought to ask yet. He was not cruel. He was thorough. In military circles, thorough is sometimes harder to survive than cruel. Maya did not know the general was on base. Nobody in her bay did. The inspection team moved through facilities on a schedule that was, by design, not shared with the people being inspected. She was still adjusting the weapon when she heard the footsteps, the particular cadence of a group moving with purpose, the kind of group that parts the air differently than a casual walk. She looked up. Her hands went still. General Webb stood at the entrance to the bay with Captain Howell slightly behind him and to the left, and 2 aides flanking both. The general was looking directly at her. Not at the group of soldiers by the vehicle bay. Not at the inventory racks along the far wall. At her. At her hands on the weapon. Maya did not move. This was the right instinct. She stood where she was, hands visible, posture correct, and waited. She had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can do when a superior officer is looking at you is perform the act of being noticed. You just stand in what you were already doing and let them come to their own conclusions. General Webb walked across the bay. He stopped 6 feet from her and looked at the weapon in her hands with the particular attention of someone who actually knows what they're looking at. "What's the problem with it?" he said. "Retention mechanism on the strap assembly is sitting about 2 millimeters off the correct position, sir," Maya said. "I've logged the hardware fault and the replacement part is inbound. I'm doing a manual compression adjustment to keep the retention correct until it arrives." The general held out his hand. She presented the weapon correctly barrel-oriented safely, both hands visible during transfer. He examined the mechanism she had described, found it with his thumb in about 4 seconds, and pressed it the way she had been pressing it. "You're right," he said. He handed it back. "How long has it been off?" 72 hours, sir. I flagged it on first identification." He nodded. Then, he looked at her sleeve. The badge there was the one that had taken her 2 years of additional qualification work to earn, the Master Gunner badge, which sat above her other designations and, which, in her occupational specialty, was the highest technical certification available. It was not common. It was particularly not common on someone of her rank. The general looked at it the way you look at something that surprises you but that you don't want to admit surprises you. "How long?" he said. "Earned it 11 months ago, sir." "At your current rank?" "Yes, sir." Captain Howell, standing behind the general, had the expression of a man watching something happen that he suspected might go very well or very badly and was not yet sure which. General Webb looked at her for another moment. Not the look of assessment that had already happened. This was something else, the look of someone filing something away. "Carry on, Sergeant," he said. He moved on through the bay. Maya put the weapon back in the correct adjustment position, finished what she was doing, and did not speak for approximately 4 minutes. The soldier working 2 stations down from her, a young specialist named Torres who had watched the whole thing, finally said, very quietly, "What just happened?" "Inspection," Maya said. That was the general. "I know." Torres looked at her like she had grown a second head. Maya picked up her maintenance log and started writing down the completion of the adjustment, time-stamped, correctly formatted. Her hands were completely steady. This was not because she hadn't felt anything. This was because she had learned, somewhere between Laredo and this moment, that the feelings and the hands were separate things, and you controlled the hands first. The feelings could wait. What she did not know yet, what nobody in the bay knew, was that General Webb, as he moved through the rest of the facility, said something to Captain Howell that Howell would later relay to Maya almost word for word. He had said, "That sergeant. Who trained her?" And Howell had said her name and her background, and the general had listened and said nothing else. But he had taken out a small notebook, the kind that military men of his generation kept in a breast pocket, and written something in it. Howell had seen him do it. He didn't know what was written. But he had seen the general do this exactly twice before in his career, and both times something had changed for the person whose name went in that notebook. Maya finished her shift that day and drove back to her quarters and called her father in Laredo. She didn't tell him about the inspection. She asked how he was doing and listened to him talk about the neighbor's broken fence and the weather and the price of groceries. After 20 minutes she said goodnight and sat in the quiet of her room and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the general's face when he looked at the badge. She had spent 11 years building toward that look, not the recognition itself, but the right to it. The right to stand in a room and have what she knew speak before anyone could decide what to think about who she was. She was not there yet. She knew that. But she was in the building. She closed her eyes and thought about her father at the kitchen table, the slow nod, the words he chose instead of "be careful." She thought about the badge on her sleeve, each qualification behind it, the hours that had no glamour in them, the tests she had taken and taken again until she passed them correctly. She thought about Torres asking what had happened, and the way the question assumed something remarkable must have occurred. Something had. Just not the thing Torres thought. What had happened was 11 years of ordinary, invisible, relentless work arriving at a single moment in a weapons bay in Fort Bragg in October and being, for the first time, briefly visible. That was what had happened. She turned off the light and went to sleep, and in the morning she was back in the bay at 0600 doing exactly what she had been doing the day before. The weapon with the misaligned retention mechanism had its replacement part delivered at 0800. She installed it, tested it, logged the completion, and moved to the next item on the maintenance list. The notebook in the general's breast pocket, and whatever was written in it, was not something she thought about. She had learned a long time ago that the only thing you can actually control is the work in front of you. Everything else, the recognition, the opportunity, the moment when the right person happens to be standing in the doorway, that was the part you couldn't manufacture. You could only make sure that when it arrived, it found you doing the right thing. It had found her adjusting a weapon. She had been adjusting it correctly. That was enough. For now, it was enough. 3 weeks after the inspection, Captain Howell called Maya into his office at 14:30 on a Tuesday and told her to close the door. This was unusual. Howell was not a close-the-door kind of officer unless something was either very good or very bad, and the expression on his face when she sat down across from him did not clearly belong to either category. He had a folder on his desk that he didn't open right away. He looked at her for a moment like he was deciding on the correct sequence of words. "You've been selected for the Advanced Integration Program," he said. Maya had heard of the program the way you hear of something that exists at the edge of your field, not a rumor exactly, more like a geographical feature you know is there but have never had reason to approach. The Advanced Integration Program, or AIP, was a 12-month assignment that placed mid-career NCOs into roles that crossed traditional occupational lines, pairing weapons specialists with intelligence analysts, logistics people with operations planners, putting people who normally worked in their designated lane into a structure where the lanes dissolved. The theory was that modern combat required integration that the standard specialization track didn't build. The practice was that very few people below the rank of E8 were considered for it. Maya was an E6. She looked at the folder. "Who submitted my name?" Howell picked up a pen and set it down again, which was as close as he ever got to a fidget. "The selection came from above my level," he said, which was not an answer and both of them knew it. She thought about a notebook in a breast pocket. She thought about a man who had found a misaligned retention mechanism with his thumb in 4 seconds and known exactly what he was looking at. "When does it start?" she said. "January 14th. You'd report to the integration facility at Quantico." Quantico was Marines territory, which meant this was a joint program, which meant the complexity of what she was being dropped into had layers she couldn't fully see yet. She looked at the folder again. "Can I have time to review the brief?" "You have until Friday." She took the folder home that night and read every page of it twice. The program was real and demanding in ways that the summary language tried to soften but couldn't quite manage. She would be working alongside officers senior to her in rank, alongside people from branches of the military with cultures and operational vocabularies different from hers, alongside intelligence community liaisons whose backgrounds she would not be fully briefed on. She would be the most junior person in most rooms she entered. She would be expected to contribute at a level that her rank did not technically require of her, which meant she would be visible in a way that could go two directions. It could demonstrate capability, or it could expose a gap, and there would be no quiet middle ground in which to figure out which was happening. She thought about her father. She called him that night, not about the program. She wasn't cleared to discuss the specifics, but just to hear the particular steadiness of his voice, which had a quality she couldn't name precisely but that she associated with the knowledge that difficult things can be survived without being destroyed by them. He talked about the neighbor's fence again. Apparently it still hadn't been fixed. She listened and laughed in the right places, and after she hung up she sat at her kitchen table and wrote a list on a legal pad of every gap she could identify in her current knowledge base, every area where she knew she was operating at competence rather than mastery, every room she hadn't yet fully walked into. The list was 2 pages long. She looked at it without distress. A gap you can name is a gap you can close. She accepted the assignment on Thursday, one day before the deadline. The next 10 weeks were preparation she built herself because there was no formal pre-programmed curriculum. She requested access to Joint Operations documentation that was available at her clearance level and read it systematically. She found a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant named Peterson who was stationed at Bragg for a cross-training rotation and asked him, directly and without preamble, to explain the ways Marine weapons protocols differed from Army protocols at the integration points, because she was about to work in a joint environment and she didn't want to be the person who caused friction by not knowing the cultural differences. Peterson looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating an assumption, and then said sure, and they spent 3 evenings over 2 weeks in the common area of the NCO quarters going through it. He was a good teacher when someone gave him a reason to be. She also, in this period, had one conversation that she did not plan and did not record in any log. She was in the gym at 0530 on a Thursday morning, running on the treadmill in the quiet of the early hour when the facility was mostly empty, when General Webb walked in. She recognized him immediately. He recognized her with the same speed, which told her the filing away she had watched happen in the bay had been thorough. He did not approach her while she was on the treadmill. He went to the free weights at the far end of the room and began his own routine. She kept running. After about 20 minutes, she finished her run, cooled down, and was at the water fountain when he came up beside her. "Sergeant Reyes," he said. "General," she said. "You accepted the AIP assignment." It was not a question. She confirmed it anyway. "Yes, sir." He picked up his water bottle and looked at the wall in front of them for a moment, the way people look when they're choosing what to say out of several options. "The program is harder than the brief suggests," he said. "Not technically. Interpersonally. You'll be the lowest ranking person in most rooms. People will make assumptions. The assumptions will be wrong, but they'll still be the thing you're navigating." Maya considered this. "That's not new terrain for me, sir." He looked at her then. "No," he said. "I didn't think it was." He picked up his water bottle. "The badge on your sleeve will carry weight in that environment, but only if you let it speak before you explain it. The moment you start explaining it, you've already lost something." He walked back to his weights. The conversation was over. It had lasted maybe 90 seconds. Maya walked back to the treadmill area, gathered her things, and left the gym. She thought about what he had said the whole way back to her quarters, not because it was advice she hadn't considered, but because the precision of it confirmed something she had suspected. The general was not watching her because of the inspection. The inspection had simply been the moment he saw something he already knew how to recognize. He had been watching her since before he knew her name, in the way that certain leaders watch for a particular quality of readiness in the people around them, the way a talent scout watches a game, not rooting for anyone in particular, just waiting to see who plays the way the game actually demands. She arrived at Quantico on January 14 in a rental car with 2 duffel bags and the legal pad list of gaps, which by now had been worked through to the point where she had crossed off 11 of the original items and added 4 new ones. She checked in at the administrative office and was given a room assignment and a program schedule and a roster of the other participants. There were 16 people in the cohort. She scanned the roster in the elevator going up to her floor. 4 officers, 12 NCOs. The lowest ranked officer was a first lieutenant. Of the 12 NCOs, the next most junior was an E7. She was, as predicted, the lowest rank in the room. She was also the only woman in the cohort who held a Master Gunner designation, and, when she checked the roster qualifications listed beside each name, she was one of 2 people whose technical certification was at the master level in their specialty. The other was a Navy Chief Petty Officer named Okafor who had more years of service than Maya had been alive. She folded the roster and put it in her jacket pocket and went to her room and unpacked her 2 bags in the efficient, organized way she did everything, putting each item in a logical place so that she could find it in the dark if she needed to. Then, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window at the bare January trees. She thought about the general's words. Let the badge speak before you explain it. The moment you explain it, you've lost something. She understood this in the practical sense that the instinct to justify yourself to a room that underestimates you is exactly the instinct that confirms their underestimation. But there was a deeper truth in it that she was still working through, something about the difference between knowing your own capability and needing others to confirm it. She had spent 11 years building. She was still, at some level, waiting for the building to feel finished. It didn't yet. She wasn't sure it was supposed to. The first cohort meeting was at 0700 the next morning. She arrived 4 minutes early, which put her there before 8 of the 16 participants. She chose a seat near the middle of the table, not the back, which would read as diffidence, not the front, which would read as performance. She put her notebook on the table, her pen parallel to the notebook, and looked at the door. The Navy Chief, Okafor, came in 2 minutes later, looked at the room, and sat directly across from her. He looked at her badge with the quick reading eye of someone who knows the credentials of his own world. Then, he looked at her face. Chief Petty Officer Okafor, he said. Staff Sergeant Reyes, she said. He nodded once, the way her father had nodded at the kitchen table years ago, and she thought that some gestures translate across every geography and background, the nod that means I see you and I'm not going to make it a bigger deal than it needs to be right now. The program director came in at exactly 0700 and began without ceremony. His name was Colonel Thatch, and he had the manner of a man who had gotten very tired of inefficiency and had organized his entire personality around eliminating it. He looked at the cohort, said good morning, and then said something that Maya wrote down verbatim in her notebook. The only thing we are going to build in this room, he said, is the capacity to think across seams. The seams between specialties. The seams between branches. The seams between what we know and what we need to know. If you are not comfortable at seams, this is going to be a difficult year. If you are exactly what this program is for. Maya looked down at her notebook. She had been living at seams her entire life. The seam between the country she was born in and the country her father had come from. The seam between the world that had trained her to be less visible and the instinct that refused that. The seam between what she knew and what the room would allow her to demonstrate. She thought about all of it for exactly as long as it took Colonel Thatch to move to the next slide. Then, she put her pen to the paper and started taking notes. The work was what mattered. It had always been the work. The first month at Quantico established a particular social architecture in the cohort, the way a new environment always does, the people who moved toward each other naturally, the people who stayed in their own branch cultures, the people who watched before deciding where they fit. Maya was a watcher. She was not unfriendly. She showed up to the evening mess with the others, sat where there was space, listened to the conversations that formed around her, and built a map of the room's internal dynamics the way she would map a weapons system, systematically, without rushing the process, understanding that you do not engage a mechanism you haven't first understood. By the end of week 2, the map was clear enough to move on. There were 2 people in the cohort who were already doing the work at the level she recognized as genuinely excellent, Chief Okafor, who thought in systems the way she did, and had the additional depth of 23 years of operational experience in environments she hadn't worked in, and a first lieutenant named Kavanaugh from Army Aviation who had a particular kind of spatial intelligence that showed up in the way she described problems, always in 3 dimensions, always with a instinctive awareness of where the vulnerable point in a structure sat. The rest of the cohort ranged from competent to strong. 2 people she privately assessed as having been selected more for their social positioning than their technical depth, which was not unusual and not her concern. The dynamic that required management was Lieutenant Colonel Graves. Graves was the senior officer in the cohort by a significant margin, a logistician from the Army with 26 years in and an internal certainty about his own perspective that had probably served him well in a world where that certainty was appropriate and was visibly less useful here. He was not a bad officer. He was a specific kind of officer, the kind who hears the answer form in his head before the question is finished and has learned to trust that instinct because it has been right often enough that its failures don't register with the same weight as its successes. In the second week, during a joint planning exercise that required the cohort to work through a simulated integration scenario, Graves presented his framework for the problem in the first 10 minutes of the group session, clearly and with confidence, and then spent the next 40 minutes of the session reinforcing and elaborating on that framework in ways that made it structurally difficult for anyone else's analysis to gain ground. It was not deliberately hostile. It was the conversational equivalent of a person who stands in a doorway without realizing they're blocking it. Maya sat through the session and said nothing. She wrote in her notebook. When the session ended and Colonel Thatch opened the floor for debrief, she raised her hand, which she had not done before in a group setting. The logistics framework Lieutenant Colonel Graves outlined accounts for the resource movement efficiently, she said. The gap I'm seeing is at the integration point between the logistics timeline and the weapons readiness state of the units receiving the resources. If the delivery schedule lands correctly but the receiving unit's weapon systems haven't completed their current maintenance cycle, the efficiency of the logistics framework doesn't translate to operational readiness. You've moved resources to a unit that can't deploy them on the timeline the plan requires. The room was quiet for a moment. Graves looked at her with the specific expression of a man who is deciding whether he has been corrected or supplemented. Colonel Thatch said, "Walk us through the specific integration point." She did. She had the maintenance cycle data from her preparation work, the standard cycle times for the relevant weapons systems, the variance windows, the friction points in the handoff. She laid it out in 12 minutes without notes, because she had internalized it. When she finished, Thatch nodded once, and Okafor, across the table, was writing quickly in his own notebook. Graves said nothing immediately. He looked at his own notes, then at the whiteboard, then at Maya. "That's a valid integration concern," he said finally. "I'll incorporate it into the revised framework." This was, Maya recognized, the best possible response he could have given. It was not easy for a man like Graves to give it. She respected that he did. After the session, Okafor fell into step beside her in the corridor. He said, without looking at her, "You've been sitting on that since day one." "I needed to understand the room before I spoke in it. Most people don't wait that long. Most people are in more of a hurry than they need to be," she said. He laughed, a short, warm sound that seemed to surprise him slightly. "Fair enough," he said. The two of them began working together in the evenings after that, which was informal and not required by the program structure but which both of them found useful in the same way. They were people who processed information by talking through it with someone who pushed back on the logic rather than just agreeing with the conclusion. Okafor's area of depth was naval weapons integration, which was a world Maya knew theoretically but not experientially. Her depth was in the ground-based systems and the maintenance architecture that most people above the operational level didn't understand in detail. Together they built a working vocabulary across the scene between their two worlds, which was exactly what Thatch had said the program was designed to build, though the two of them were doing it before the curriculum had formally directed them toward it. Around the 6th week, the program introduced what the curriculum called scenario architecture, a series of increasingly complex simulations in which the cohort had to plan and execute an integrated response to a multi-domain problem. The scenarios were not announced in advance. The first one arrived at 0600 on a Tuesday with a briefing packet and a 2-hour planning window before the simulation began. The scenario involved a situation in which a coalition force needed to establish a defensive position in a contested environment, coordinating logistics, weapons placement, communications, and intelligence integration simultaneously across a timeline that had insufficient slack in it for sequential planning. The problem was designed, Maya understood within the first 10 minutes of reading the brief, specifically to break apart any planning approach that treated the different domains as separate problems to be solved in order. The domains had to be solved simultaneously or they wouldn't be solved in time. The cohort went into planning mode. Graves immediately began structuring the logistics problem, which was his instinct and his strength. Kavanaugh began working the positioning geometry. Two of the Army intelligence officers began pulling the threat assessment. The group was competent. The group was also, Maya could see, on a trajectory to produce 4 separate plans that would collide badly at the integration points. She had the experience of watching a room move confidently toward a wall. She stood up. "We need a common integration timeline before we go any deeper into the domain-specific planning," she said. "If we build 4 plans independently and try to merge them at the end, we won't make the 2-hour window. We build the integration points first and plan outward from those." There was the brief pause that Arun gives when someone changes the structure of what's happening. Graves looked up from his logistics charts. Then, he did something that told Maya he had been genuinely paying attention since the session where she had identified the maintenance cycle gap. He said, "Agreed. How do you want to structure it?" She structured it. She put a framework on the whiteboard that identified the 7 integration points in the scenario where the domains were required to intersect, established a timeline priority for each, and assigned pairs to work each integration point with representation from the relevant specialties. It took 14 minutes. The remaining hour and 46 minutes of the planning window were used with the efficiency of a group that knew exactly where it was going and why. When Thatch ran the simulation debrief afterward, he said the integration plan was the most structurally coherent the cohort had produced. He did not say whose framework it was. He didn't need to. The room knew. After that session, something shifted in how the cohort organized around her. Not in a dramatic way, there were no speeches, no formal acknowledgments. It was subtler. The physical space of rooms rearranged slightly, the way rooms do when the actual center of a group's decision-making becomes clearer. People placed themselves closer to where she was sitting. Graves stopped being the first to speak in planning sessions. When Thatch posed a new problem to the room, there were 2 or 3 seconds before anyone responded, during which the cohort was, without quite knowing it, waiting to see which direction Maya would lean. She noticed this and did not perform any response to it. She kept coming to sessions 4 minutes early. She kept her notebook parallel to her pen. She kept working on the items still left on her legal pad list of gaps, which was down to 2 items now, both of which required experience she didn't have yet and couldn't accelerate. In the 8th week she received a communication from Fort Bragg. Captain Howell, who had been promoted to major while she was at Quantico, wrote to inform her that the replacement part she had ordered for the misaligned retention mechanism before she left had been installed by her replacement in the weapons bay and that the system had been logged as fully operational. He added, at the end of the message, in the slightly warmer register of a superior officer writing to someone he no longer had direct authority over, "General Webb asked about your program progress last week. I told him you were doing well." He nodded like he already knew. She read this twice. Then, she put her phone in her pocket and went back to the scenario analysis she had been working on. The notebook in the breast pocket. The nod that wasn't surprise because nothing that was happening had been, for a man who knew how to look at what was in front of him, a surprise at all. She thought about that for a moment, the idea of being seen before you knew you were being seen. It should have felt like surveillance. It didn't. It felt like something she didn't quite have a word for, something adjacent to the feeling she had when she ran a diagnostic on a weapons system and found that every component was functioning at specification. Not excitement. Confirmation. The sense that a thing you built carefully is doing exactly what you built it to do. She was not the thing being confirmed. She understood that. She was the one doing the building. The thing being confirmed was the argument that a certain kind of preparation, sustained over a long time, in conditions that don't offer applause, that this kind of preparation eventually becomes visible. Eventually, if you are patient and you don't stop, the room you need to be in finds you. Or more precisely, you find it. You find it because you have been, every single day, building the specific thing that it requires. She picked up her pen and went back to the scenario analysis, and the afternoon light came through the window of the Quantico study room at the angle that meant the day had passed faster than she had noticed, which was always a sign, she thought, that the work had been real. The final evaluation at Quantico was not announced as the final evaluation until 4 days before it happened. This was by design. Colonel Thatch told the cohort on a Monday morning that the capstone scenario would begin Thursday at 0600 and that it would run for 36 continuous hours, with no pre-briefing provided beyond the initial packet, and that the assessment would evaluate not just the quality of the decisions made but the process by which the group arrived at them. He said this calmly and without drama. He was the kind of man who believed that the appropriate response to a difficult thing was to describe it accurately and then proceed. The cohort's response to this announcement mapped almost perfectly to their psychological profiles as Maya had assembled them over the previous 9 weeks. Kavanaugh began pulling additional reference materials. Okafor went quiet in the way that quiet people go quiet when they are already thinking about what needs to be done. Graves started talking about logistics prepositioning, which was both his genuine instinct and his comfort mechanism when uncertainty arrived. 2 of the cohort's weaker members immediately asked questions that were really requests for reassurance in the grammatical form of questions. Maya listened to all of it and then went to lunch. She was not dismissive of the stakes. The capstone mattered. It would be reviewed by a panel that included people she would never meet, and its outcome would shape what came next in ways she could not fully see. But she had learned, over years of understanding how pressure worked inside her own nervous system, that the period before a difficult thing required stillness, not acceleration. You had done the preparation or you hadn't. You knew the material or you didn't. The days before were not going to substantially change either of those realities. What they could do, if you let anxiety govern them, was erode your ability to access what you actually knew when you needed it. She spent Tuesday finishing the 2 remaining items on the legal pad list. One of them, a gap in her understanding of joint air-ground coordination protocols. She closed through a 3-hour session with an Air Force liaison attached to the program who had been available the entire time and whom she now realized she should have approached 6 weeks ago. The other item on the list she looked at, thought about, and crossed off with the specific acknowledgement that this was a gap she would close with experience, not with reading, and that the capstone would likely provide some of that experience regardless of how she performed. On Wednesday evening, the cohort had dinner together at the mess facility in something that functioned as the program's version of a farewell meal, though nobody called it that. People were looser than they had been, the way people get when the official part of something is almost over and the social armor starts to come off a layer. Graves told a story about a logistics operation in his second deployment that had gone catastrophically wrong in a way that was genuinely funny at the distance of 20 years. Kavanaugh talked about learning to fly, the specific terror and focus of the first solo landing. Okafor listened to everything with his customary quietness and, at one point said, to no one in particular, "I'm going to miss this room," and everyone understood what he meant, which was not the physical room but the specific configuration of people in it and what they had built together across 9 weeks of working at the seams. Maya said less than most, which was her way, but she was present in the room in a way that she recognized in herself as rare, fully there, not managing it, not watching herself from outside. She thought about the strange quality of the cohort's development, how the 16 of them had arrived as representatives of their individual specialties and their individual branch cultures and their individual ranks, all of those things serving as the initial filters through which they assessed each other, and how those filters had gradually become less relevant as the actual capability of each person became the primary data set. By the end of 9 weeks, she genuinely did not think about rank when she was working with Okafor or Kavanaugh or even Graves. She thought about what they knew and how they thought. The rank was a fact of the military structure. It was not the fact that mattered inside the work. She went to bed at 2200, which was earlier than she wanted and later than she should have, and slept better than she expected. The capstone packet arrived at 0600 Thursday as promised. Maya read it in 11 minutes. The scenario was, as she had anticipated, a multi-domain problem with integrated stressors, a coalition environment, incomplete intelligence, a logistics chain with 2 deliberate points of failure built in, a weapons readiness issue embedded in the data that would only be visible to someone who knew what to look for in the maintenance records, and a timeline that was, once again, structured to punish sequential thinking. She looked up from the packet at the rest of the cohort, who were still reading. Then, she looked back down at the weapons readiness issue. It was embedded in a single line of a maintenance log summary that was included in the intelligence packet as background material, formatted to look like administrative data rather than operationally relevant information. She almost missed it. She would have missed it 3 years ago. She did not miss it now because 11 years of reading maintenance logs at the level of a master gunner had built a kind of peripheral vision for the specific patterns that indicated a problem, the log entry that was 2 days older than it should be given the recorded usage hours, the slight discrepancy in the reported service intervals. She circled it. She wrote one word beside it, critical. When the cohort moved into planning mode, she did not wait for the room to organize itself around someone else's structure. She went to the whiteboard. Before we map the integration points, she said, there's a readiness issue in the data that changes the entire deployment timeline. If we plan from the assumption that this unit's systems are ready to deploy, we build toward a failure that we won't see coming until it's too late to recover. She walked them through the maintenance log entry, the discrepancy, the implication. 8 minutes. No notes. Thatch, who was observing in the corner of the room, wrote something on his clipboard. Maya did not look at him. The planning proceeded. She ran the integration framework again, building it first and letting the domain-specific planning flow outward from the fixed points. Graves managed the logistics with the specific efficiency he'd been developing all program long, now channeled into a structure that coordinated with the other domains instead of competing with them. Kavanaugh handled the positioning geometry. Okafor bridged the naval and ground integration with the fluency that 23 years and 9 weeks of deliberate work had built. Maya moved between the integration points the way a maintenance technician moves through a system, not doing everything, but aware of every connection, watching for the points where friction could develop before it became a failure. 36 hours was a long time. It was long in the way that any continuous operation is long. The first 12 hours were high intensity and the energy was available. The second 12 required more deliberate management of attention and decision quality. The final 12 were a test of something that had no good word in the performance literature but that soldiers understood intuitively, the capacity to continue making good decisions when the conditions most favorable to good decisions had been stripped away by exhaustion and uncertainty and the accumulated weight of everything that had gone wrong. Things went wrong. The logistics chain failures activated in hour 14, which was the designed point of maximum exhaustion for the cohort and was clearly chosen deliberately to see what happened to decision-making under those conditions. One of the 2 cohort members Maya had assessed as weaker made a decision in hour 22 that required a correction that cost them an hour of the timeline. She made the correction without comment on how it had been needed. There was no time for comment and no value in it. She slept 3 hours in hour 19 to 22, which she had planned in advance as the optimal rest window given the scenario's likely stress points. When she woke and came back to the operations room, she found Okafor at the table with coffee and the current status board, and they sat together in the quiet of 0300 and went through the remaining integration points with the focused economy of people who have run out of anything extra and are working entirely from the core of what they know. You caught that maintenance log entry, Okafor said, not for the first time, but, this time quietly, in the particular register that means something different than a professional observation. It's what I do, she said. Nobody else in the room saw it. Someone would have, she said. Eventually. He looked at her steadily. You're very careful about not needing credit for things. She thought about this. She thought about the general's words in the gym, the badge should speak before you explain it. She thought about her father at the kitchen table. She thought about 11 years of work in a world that had required her to build twice as much to be seen half as clearly, and how she had made a decision somewhere in those years, not a dramatic decision, not a moment of cinematic resolve, just a quiet settling, that she was not going to let the injustice of that calibration make her bitter, because bitter was a consumption that would take from the work, and the work was the only thing she actually controlled. Credit isn't the point, she said. Whether the plan works is the point. If the plan works and nobody remembers who caught the maintenance issue, we still didn't lose the unit. Okafor looked at her for a moment, then down at his coffee. I'm going to remember who caught it, he said. The capstone concluded at 1800 on Friday. The cohort sat in the debriefing room looking like people who had been awake too long and worked too hard and did not regret either thing. Thatch walked them through the evaluation analysis, which was comprehensive and unsentimental in the way that his teaching had been all program long. He identified the decisions that had worked and the ones that hadn't, the integration points that had held and the one that had required emergency correction, the moment when the maintenance log entry had been surfaced and how that had changed the plan's viability. He did not attach names to any of it. He did not need to. The room knew the record of what had happened. At the end of the debrief, he looked at the cohort and said something that Maya would carry with her for a long time. He said, the seams in any system are the most dangerous places and the most important places. They're where failures happen and where integration happens. The people who are most valuable in any complex environment are the people who can live at the seams without losing themselves in them. He paused. Most of you have gotten better at that this year. A few of you were already built for it. He didn't look at anyone specifically. He didn't need to. Maya flew back to Fort Bragg 2 days later. Major Howell met her at the processing office for the reintegration brief, which was mostly administrative and took 40 minutes. When it was done, he walked with her out of the building into the October air. It was October again, a year later, and the air had the same quality it had the morning she had first stood at the gate watching how other soldiers walked. Sharp. Pine. The feeling of being on the edge of something. There's a communication waiting for you, Howell said. Official. It came from Webb's office. She looked at him. He's standing up a new integration advisory panel, Howell said. It's going to interface with the Joint Commands on Weapons Logistics Operations integration problems. He's personally requesting you as the senior NCO technical advisor. She thought about a notebook in a breast pocket and a man who had found a misaligned retention mechanism with his thumb in 4 seconds. He watched the whole capstone evaluation, Howell said. I don't know how. But apparently he did. She nodded. She looked at the tree line beyond the training fields. She thought about Okafor saying I'm going to remember who caught it. She thought about Kavanaugh and her spatial intelligence and Graves, who had, by the end of the program, become genuinely good at the thing the program was designed to build. She thought about Torres, in the weapons bay a year ago, asking what had happened, the question carrying the assumption that something remarkable must have occurred. Something had. The same remarkable thing that had been occurring every day for 11 years, in the hours nobody saw, in the maintenance logs nobody read carefully enough, in the repeated taking of qualifications until she passed them at the highest level, in the 2-page list of gaps she had named and, then, closed one by one. The unremarkable accumulation of extraordinary specificity. The building of a thing so precisely suited to what the room would eventually require that when the room arrived, there was nothing left to do but walk into it. She called her father that evening. He was eating dinner when she called, and he told her about the neighbor's fence, which had finally been fixed. She listened and laughed in the right places and then told him, not about the advisory panel that would come later, but about the capstone, about Okafor and the maintenance log, about 36 hours of continuous work at the integration points. He was quiet for a moment in the way he had been quiet at the kitchen table years ago when she told him she had enlisted. You did good, he said. Not you were safe. Not I'm proud of you. You did good. It was not high praise in its words. It was everything in its specificity. It was the words of a man who had spent a lifetime in the gap between what he was given and what he built from it, who knew exactly what it cost to do the work the right way in a world that does not always reward the right way, and who recognized in his daughter the particular quality of someone who had learned that lesson not as a grievance but as a foundation. She held the phone for a moment after the call ended. Outside the window of her quarters, the Fort Bragg tree line was dark against the early evening sky. A year ago she had stood at the gate watching how people walked. Tomorrow she would report to a meeting in a building where the work was going to be harder and more visible than anything she had done before, where the room would contain people who had not yet been given a reason to see her clearly, and where she would carry the badge on her sleeve and let it speak before she explained it. She put her phone down. She set her boots by the door in the correct position. She turned off the light. The work was waiting. It was always waiting. That was the only thing about it she had ever been able to count on, and it was, in the end, the only thing she had ever really needed.